Good evening. I'm Kathryn Smith, General Director of Madison Opera. Thank you for joining me for a preview of our upcoming production of Offenbach's Orpheus in the Underworld. I'll start by talking about Offenbach and his career, and then focus on Orpheus itself. When I'm done with my presentation, we'll go to your questions. If you are watching on April 8th, please type your questions into the YouTube conversation box so I can see them. If you type them while I'm talking, I will see them when I'm done. If you are watching this after April 8th and have questions, feel free to email me at info@madisonopera.org. Now I will ask the magic people to share my screen. So, Jacob Offenbach was born in 1819 in Cologne, Germany. His father had been born at Offenbach am Main and was known as der Offenbacher, which then turned into the family's last name. The family was Jewish, and Jacob's father was a cantor, music teacher, and composer. Jacob was the seventh of 10 children. His father started him on violin at age 6. This turned to cello by age 9, at which point he started composing songs and dances. One biographer says that by age 12, Jacob was performing his own compositions, the technical difficulties of which terrified his father. He also formed a piano trio with his older siblings, and they used to play in local bars. When he was 14, his father took him and his brother to Paris to study. This was partly for a better music school, but also because Paris was more tolerant to Jews than Germany. Despite being both too young and not French, both boys were accepted by the Paris Conservatory. To make money, they sang in the local synagogue choir. This was the point at which Jacob became Jacques. But while his brother was a diligent student, Jacques was not, and left the conservatory after a year. He continued to study cello and composition privately. To earn a living, he played cello in the pit orchestra of Paris's Opera Comique, where he was something of a problem child, doing things like sabotaging music stands, playing alternate notes of the score during performances, and more. He left the orchestra at age 19 and started playing private concerts around Paris. At age 20, he wrote his first composition for the stage, a few songs for one-act vaudeville, but that didn't lead to anything. As his reputation as a cellist grew, he toured around Europe, playing alongside Liszt and Mendelssohn, and even giving a Royal Command performance at Windsor Castle in front of Queen Victoria and Tsar Nicholas I. A British critic wrote, "Offenbach's execution and taste excited both wonder and pleasure, the genius he exhibited amounting to absolute inspiration." When he was 25, he converted to Catholicism so he could marry Herminie Delsan, a 17-year-old to whom he had dedicated his first popular song. They would have 5 children together. In his late 20s, Offenbach started shifting to composing, adding his own pieces to his cello concerts. For example, in 1846, he gave a concert with 7 pieces he had written in front of an audience that included prominent critics. But just as it seemed he was ready to break through as a composer, the 1848 revolution happened, sweeping King Louis-Philippe from the throne and causing serious bloodshed in Paris. Offenbach calmed down, so he returned to Paris and became musical director of the Comédie Française, a post he held for 6 years. This was the French classical theater, which had been founded by Molière, and his duties there included composing incidental music for the plays. The Opera Comique continued to hire him as a cellist and even a conductor, but were not interested in his compositions. One of his friends said Offenbach made almost 4,000 visits to various Opera Comique officials over the years, to no avail. Time for a pet photo. I like to scatter pet photos into my talks on the theory that everyone's life is improved by looking at cute animals. The ones I'll show tonight reside with some of our Orpheus cast members. So this is Rosie, who lives with Kirsten Lippert, who is singing the role of Venus. In 1853, Offenbach premiered Pepito, a small work that was a parody of Rossini, followed by a couple of other small works that could best be described as fringe opera. A bigger deal was The Queen of the Isles in 1855. It told of a string bass player shipwrecked on an island with a cannibal queen and was a comic smash. But the 36-year-old Offenbach had a new idea in mind. From the newspaper Le Figaro, May 1855. Our friend Jacques Offenbach has just leased a new theater that he will manage opposite the Olympic Circus. It is a theater more than anything consecrated to open-hearted laughter, to fantasy, to light and smart melody, to bold refrains. Indeed, he had just leased a 300-seat theater on the Champs-Élysées. The location and timing were strategic. 1855 was the year of the Second Empire's first exposition, designed to show off the glories of France. This meant a lot of tourists streaming into Paris over the spring and summer looking for entertainment. Offenbach had only 20 days to open his theater. He named it the Bouffes-Parisiens, telling authorities he was creating a new and original kind of musical theater. His theater license allowed for harlequinades, pantomimes, comic scenes, conjuring tricks, dances, shadow plays, puppet plays, and songs, as long as there were only 3 people on stage. So that meant a series of very small-scale works. The theater opened on July 5, 1855. The most popular piece on the bill was The Two Blind Men, which told of 2 beggars pretending to be blind. A command performance of the work was soon given for Emperor Napoleon III. The Bouffes-Parisiens was a hit, so Offenbach quit his job at the Comédie Française and rented a winter theater that seated 900 people. He was now allowed to have 4 performers instead of 3, and his orchestra could have 30 players instead of 16. The next summer, he was back at the small theater, and he continued to go back and forth between the two for several years. Here is a list of his first few years' worth of compositions. And you might wonder what we call these works. Are they chamber operas? Are they operettas? Offenbach himself did not bother with definitions. He wrote what would entertain his audience, and sell tickets. His works were always funny, almost always involved dialogue, and the small ones were usually a half-hour long or less. In 1857, he sponsored a 1-act operetta writing competition for young composers. One of the 2 winners was the 18-year-old Georges Bizet, who would later write Carmen. That same year, Offenbach's troupe went on tour, including to London, where Queen Victoria attended a performance. In 1858, the French government lifted the restrictions on the number of performers Offenbach could use, so he produced his first full-length work, Orpheus in the Underworld, which turned the Orpheus and Eurydice myth on its head. We will come back to it, but for now, know that it was a massive hit, catapulting Offenbach's reputation around the world and remaining in the repertoire for decades. Offenbach was now 39 years old. As the 1860s continued, Offenbach wrote more full-length operettas, as well as more 1-act pieces. Like his early works, these were often wildly popular, not only in Paris, but across Europe. His works were often exported to London and Vienna in particular, and he himself sometimes went on tour with his company, playing cellos at special performances. Why was he so successful? Well, he wrote tunes, bluntly, music you could hum. He was funny, and comedy sells. His humor was often risque, and that sells too. He satirized familiar stories, mythology, well-known French subjects, or contemporary society. One writer says, anything that smacked of pompousness was fair game for Offenbach and his librettists. But his satires were gentle, not mean, and their targets often enjoyed them too. Offenbach was also fortunate to have good librettists, and his works were genuinely funny. Offenbach's productions were noted for their extravagant costumes and scenery, which meant that his company was pretty much always in financial trouble. He also created stars, for example, Hortense Schneider, who started with Offenbach in his very first season at age 22. She remained Offenbach's main prima donna, creating the leads in most of his famous shows, touring to London and St. Petersburg, and becoming a household name. Her lovers came from both French and British royalty, including King Edward VII. She got married and retired at age 45 and lived another 40 years, unfortunately without writing her memoirs. Offenbach finally got to the Opera Comique in 1860 with a full-length piece called Barcouf. As you might guess from the title, the lead character was not human. It was a satire in which a dog was appointed governor of a city, and it was an unfortunate flop. Napoleon III liked Offenbach's work, despite the political satire, and gave him French citizenship in 1860 and the Légion d'honneur the following year. Offenbach was even closer with other members of the royal family. Napoleon's half-brother, the Duc de Morny, was instrumental in getting Offenbach permission to write full-length pieces. And the Duke also wrote a libretto for him, Mr. Cauliflower Will Be Home On, a spoof of Italian opera singers. The first performance was given at the Bourbon Palace for Napoleon, 4 months before it was given for the public. Meet Salome, Tinker, and Samson, who live with Gillian Hollis, who is singing the role of Cupid. At age 43, Offenbach resigned as director of the Bouffes-Parisiens, although he continued to write some works for them, as well as other theaters. These are some of his most famous. La Belle Hélène satirized the story of Helen of Troy and Paris. It was a great success, with Run Review saying, "Do you want to laugh and have fun? Do you want to see a battalion of beautiful women? Go see this." Of course, another critic called the piece grossly indecent. La Vie Parisienne, Offenbach's first work set in modern times, told of tourists in Paris. Perhaps tellingly, Offenbach said of the cast, "They don't need to know how to sing. We're not at the Opera Comique. If they are funny, it's enough for me." The star of the piece was Zulma Buffard, with whom Offenbach had an affair for almost a decade. Not shockingly, he slept with a number of his leading ladies. His biggest hit, though, was La Grande Duchesse de Gerolstein. It was a satire on militarism, mocking the pomposity and pretensions of tiny European kingdoms. It opened 2 days after the new Paris Exposition, meaning many foreign military visitors saw it, yet somehow they were not offended. Well, Prussian Chancellor Otto von Bismarck saw it and then went to war against France 3 years later, but I don't think that was connected. And finally, La Paracole, about Peruvian street singers and politicians. It has perhaps the first aria written to be sung by a drunk soprano. A digression to Offenbach's relationship with other composers. First of all, he produced them at his theater. Even in his earliest days, he offered adaptations of Mozart's The Impresario and Rossini's Il Signor Bruschino. The Bouffes-Parisiens was never an all-Offenbach theater. He also quoted their music, particularly Rossini, whose music he spoofed in several works. And Rossini returned the compliment. He called Offenbach the Mozart of the Champs-Élysées and dedicated a short piano work to him, Petite Caprice, style Offenbach. The Paris Opera at the time was dominated by the grand works of Giacomo Meyerbeer. Offenbach naturally spoofed those operas, and Meyerbeer himself attended all the Bouffes-Parisiens productions, sitting in Offenbach's private box. Not everyone was so enamored. Hector Berlioz called Offenbach the product of the mad German mind. When Richard Wagner came to Paris to oversee Tristan and Isolde at the Paris Opera, Offenbach wrote a skit about him in the Carnival of Reviews. In it, Wagner confronts the ghosts of Mozart and Gluck, proclaiming, "I am the composer of the future, and I shall crush you all," which rather sounds like something Wagner might have said. Wagner was not amused and said that Offenbach's music had the warmth of the dung heap. At the very end of his life, though, Wagner said of Offenbach, "He writes like the divine Mozart." This is Addie, who lives with Christian Sanders, who is singing the role of Orpheus. Let's go to America. Offenbach's works reached the US fast. The New York Tribune wrote in 1863, "The Bouffes-Parisiens is so little as to be almost a joke. There is, in fact, hardly enough room to swing a cat in. People do not, however, go to the Bouffes for the purpose of swinging cats. They go to listen to the brightest and newest music, to witness the best acting of its order that the French stage affords, and they are never disappointed, absolutely never." Grande Duchesse opened in New York only 5 months after the Paris premiere, the quickest any opera had ever come to the US. At a time when 30 performances was considered a smash hit, this one ran for 156 performances. One writer complained that the tunes were hummed, whistled, and played until the ear was worn to shreds. Between 1868 and 1870, there were 5 companies performing Offenbach operettas in New York City. Helping sell tickets was shock and horror in the press. Offenbach was called a purveyor of bold, bald indecency. His operas were derided for their moral filth. One writer said, "If an English company should use a literal translation, no modest woman could go a second time." In showbiz, that kind of review sells tickets. Back to France. When the Franco-Prussian War broke out in 1870, Offenbach fled France yet again, ultimately joining his family in Spain, then Italy, and then Austria. The problem was that he was completely linked to Napoleon's Second Empire. Some even called him the mockingbird of the Second Empire. When that empire fell, Offenbach's music went out of favor, and the fact that he was born Jewish and in Germany was also suspect, even though he had been a French citizen for a decade and a Catholic for 20 years. His previously successful works were vilified as everything that was superficial about Napoleon's regime. Grand Duchesse was even banned for a time in France due to its anti-military satire. He remained successful in Vienna and London, though, and supervised productions there. He even wrote a Christmas pantomime for London based on Dick Whittington and his cat. He returned to Paris at the end of 1871 and wrote a couple new works, including King Carrot, which spoofed politics via rival sorcerers and dancing vegetables. He also revived his old works to moderate success. He took on management of a new theater where he produced expanded versions of his classic works, as well as pieces by other writers. But his taste for lavish productions had not changed, and he went into almost bankruptcy within a year. To recoup some of his losses, he toured to the US in 1876, giving over 40 concerts in New York and Philadelphia. His first concert was for 5,000 people at New York's Hippodrome. The concertmaster was a 22-year-old John Philip Sousa. He was so famous that Philadelphia actually built an Offenbach Garden auditorium for him, which was later turned into a horse and carriage dealership. Offenbach wrote a book about his trip, and in it he wrote of arts funding in the United States. Let private initiative play the protective role in your country that governments play in Europe. He wrote a few more successful operettas, Madame Favart, about an actress, and The Daughter of the Drum Major, a play on Donizetti's The Daughter of the Regiment. In what turned out to be the final few years of his life, he started working on a true opera, The Tales of Hoffmann. He took stories by E.T.A. Hoffmann and turned them into a fantastical story of Hoffmann himself and the women he loved, each of whom is undone in some way by a villain. This was to be his first serious opera, as opposed to the satiric operettas. Unfortunately, he was in bad health, having suffered from gout since the 1860s. He was often unable to walk, but still he wrote. He said, "I have a terrible invincible vice, that is always to work." The Tales of Hoffmann was in rehearsal, but not quite finished, when Offenbach died in 1880 at the age of 61. He was given a state funeral and buried in the Montmartre cemetery. A newspaper wrote, "The late composer was reckoned among the masters of his art." His legacy was mixed initially. 2 years before he died, the Grove's Dictionary of Music said, "It is melancholy that of all these musical buffooneries, little or nothing will remain. These too often display merely a vulgar skepticism and a determination to be funny, even at the cost of propriety and taste." After he died, the Times of London wrote, "It is very doubtful whether any of his works will survive." But another London critic said, "I, for one, am glad he did what he did and only wish he had done more of the same." He had ultimately written more than 100 stage works in 25 years. His works have never ceased being performed in some variation or another. A Viennese obituary got it right. Offenbach was always original. We recognize his music as Offenbachish after only 2 or 3 bars. He created a new style in which he reigned absolutely alone. One of his tunes is heard a lot in the United States, and you probably don't know it's by Offenbach. It comes from a duet from Genevieve of Brabant. That was, of course, the U.S. Marine hymn played by the Marine Band. So, moving on to Orpheus in the Underworld. But before we get there, let's brush up on our mythology. I promise it will help. So first, gods and goddesses using their Roman names. Jupiter is the king of the gods, as well as god of sky and thunder. He is married to Juno, the goddess of marriage, and has many children, not all by her. His brother is Pluto, king of the underworld, aka Hades. Venus is the goddess of beauty, desire, fertility, and victory. Cupid, the god of love, is one of her sons. Mercury is the messenger of the gods, as well as god of commerce, luck, and thieves. Diana is goddess of the hunt, wild animals, fertility, and the moon. Bacchus is god of wine, vegetation, insanity, ritual madness, and theater. He has followers known as the Bacchantes. And I personally like that wine, insanity, and theater are under the same jurisdiction. Next, the myth of Orpheus, which, like all myths, has many versions, the most famous coming from Ovid's Metamorphoses. Orpheus is the son of Apollo and Calliope, one of the muses. Orpheus plays the lyre, and the myth says that nothing could resist Orpheus's beautiful melodies, neither enemies nor beasts. Orpheus marries the nymph Eurydice. A short time later, Eurydice is wandering in the forest. In some versions of the story, the shepherd Aristaeus pursues her, causing her to flee. In other versions, she is simply dancing. In all versions, she is bitten by a snake and dies. Orpheus sings of his grief and then descends to Hades to rescue his wife. He plays his lyre for Pluto, who says Orpheus can take Eurydice back to Earth under one condition. Orpheus cannot look back at Eurydice as they leave Hades. Orpheus and Eurydice begin the return, but as Orpheus cannot hear her footsteps, he begins to think the gods have fooled him. He looks back, sending Eurydice back to Hades forever. Orpheus tries to return to the underworld, but cannot. In some versions of the myth, he is killed by the Bacchantes. His head remains fully intact and sings as it floats on the water. In another version of the myth, he is killed by Jupiter, and the muses save his head to sing among living people forever. This is Chloe, who lives with Jake Surzin, who is singing the role of Mars. The Orpheus myth inspired over 70 operas between 1600 and 2020. Almost none of them involve the floating head part of the myth, probably because that is a hard role to cast. The first Orpheus opera is also the first opera whose music survives, Eurydice by Jacopo Peri, which premiered in 1600. More Orpheus operas followed in the next 200 years, by composers including Monteverdi, Charpentier, Telemann, and more. The most successful opera version was Orpheus and Eurydice by Christoph Willibald Gluck, which premiered in 1762. Gluck rewrote his opera a number of times, including a French version that was a staple of the Paris opera throughout the 19th century. And that brings us squarely to Orpheus in the Underworld. Let's start with the story of the opera, as it is not the same as the myth. The video excerpts I'm going to play, or rather that our video dog is going to play, are all from a production from the Opéra de Lyon. To make it confusing, the photos I'm showing are all from New Orleans Opera. Please just stay with me. The opera starts on Earth as the character Public Opinion introduces herself to the audience. She spies Eurydice, who is unhappily married to Orpheus, but is happily having an affair with a shepherd named Aristaeus. This is Nathalie Dessay as Eurydice. Orpheus is also having an affair, but he and Eurydice argue when she wants to get a divorce. Since Orpheus is a violinist, the fight involves his violin music. This is Nathalie Dessay and Jan Baron. Aristaeus appears, and it turns out that he is in fact Pluto in disguise. He arranges for a snake to bite Eurydice, and she is quite happy to die and go with him to the underworld. Orpheus is delighted that Eurydice is dead, but public opinion threatens to destroy his reputation If he does not, go ask the gods to give back his kidnapped wife. Orpheus grudgingly agrees. This is Jan Baron and Martine Almeida. The next scene is set on Mount Olympus, where the gods are all sleeping, although Cupid and Venus are both returning from late nights out. When Jupiter tells Diana that he turned her lover Actaeon into a stag, she and the rest of the gods declare their outrage and boredom with life on Olympus. Mercury arrives and tells everyone that he is the god of a million different things. This is Etienne Lescroix.
Et hop, la femme Mercure se tienne le cheval, à le nuage et sa voiture, rien ne l'arrête dans son vol. Et hop, la femme Mercure se tienne le cheval, à le nuage et sa voiture, rien ne l'arrête dans son vol. Oui, et dans son dictionnaire, vous dira, mais dites-le donc, je suis le commissionnaire des déesses et des dieux. Pour leurs amours, moi je travaille, actif, agile, intelligent, au cas du c'est ma médaille, une médaille en vif argent. Et hop, la femme Mercure se tienne le cheval, à le nuage et sa voiture, rien ne l'arrête dans son vol. Et hop, la femme Mercure se tienne le cheval, à le nuage, sa voiture, rien ne l'arrête dans son vol.
Mercury tells Jupiter about the abduction of Eurydice. Pluto arrives and he and Jupiter squabble, with Pluto denying any involvement with Eurydice. Their argument is interrupted by a rebellion of the gods demanding change. The arrival of Orpheus in public opinion temporarily quells the rebellion. Orpheus reluctantly asks Jupiter for the return of Eurydice. Jupiter grants his wish and decides to go down to Hades to make sure it happens. The gods plead with Jupiter to take them along, and everyone happily sets off for hell. After intermission, we are in Hades, where Eurydice is bored. Pluto is still claiming to Jupiter that Eurydice is not there, but Jupiter spots where she is hiding. After Pluto leaves, Cupid transforms Jupiter into a fly, entrancing Eurydice. This is Nathalie Dessay and Laura Nauri.
Bella, c'est quel est le danger? Veux-tu rester mon compagnon? Ces lieux dont tu forces à l'entrée, hélas, me servent de prison. Ne me quitte pas, je t'en prie, reste pour prendre bien soin de toi. Je t'aimerai, mouche jolie, reste avec moi, je t'aimerai, mouche jolie.
When Jupiter reveals his true identity, Eurydice is quite ready to follow him, and they make plans to escape during Pluto's party for the gods. Elsewhere in the underworld, the gods are having a great time. Eurydice, now dressed as a bacchante, leads everyone in a hymn to Bacchus. This is Nathalie Dessay. Jupiter insists that everyone dance the minuet, but it swiftly turns into something else. Public opinion and Orpheus arrive, and Jupiter agrees to let Eurydice leave on the condition that Orpheus not look at Eurydice as they are leaving Hades. As the unhappy couple leave the party, Jupiter sends a clap of thunder, which makes Orpheus turn around. Eurydice and Orpheus are happily free of each other. Eurydice dedicates herself to Bacchus, and everyone celebrates. So, how did we get here? It is 1858, and Offenbach has been running the Bouffes-Parisiens for 3 years, producing short works to great success. Let's meet two of his librettists, the ones who would ultimately write Orpheus. Hector Crémieux was a French playwright, librettist, and civil servant. He wrote 14 libretti for Offenbach between 1856 and 1877, as well as works for 3 other composers. Later in life, he became the head of a bank and ceased writing. When the bank collapsed, he died by suicide. Ludovic Halévy was the nephew of composer Fromental Halévy, one of Offenbach's teachers, and had joined the civil service at age 18. He met Offenbach in 1855 when he was 21 years old and wrote a piece for the opening night of the Bouffes-Parisiens. Other short works followed, usually under a pseudonym. As his fame grew, he focused solely on writing with a number of partners. In 1875, he and longtime partner Henri Meloch wrote the libretto for Bizet's Carmen. And remember that Bizet had won Offenbach's contest almost 20 years earlier. Crémieux and Halévy wrote a number of pieces together for Offenbach and other composers. Something I find interesting is that Offenbach, Halévy, and Crémieux were all Jewish in heritage. Offenbach had converted to Christianity when he got married. Halévy's father had converted upon his marriage. They were also all fairly young. At the time of Orpheus, Halévy was 24 years old, Crémieux was 28, and Offenbach was 39. During the early years of the Bouffes-Parisiens, Offenbach told his writers that during his time as music director of the Comédie Française, he got so bored by the myths and gods portrayed on stage that he swore to have revenge. Crémieux and Halévy sketched out a libretto that lampooned such characters, but could not make it work with only 3 or 4 cast members, as was legally allowed at the time. Fast forward a couple years. After Offenbach got the rights to have a full-size cast and chorus, it was time to finally have revenge on mythology. Halévy was preoccupied with his work in the civil service. According to one source, he was actually posted in Algeria, so his part went slowly. Offenbach to Halévy, July 1858. What's all this about you not being able to finish Orpheus? If you must and will become a serious man and write no more plays, you at least ought to end your career with a masterpiece. Orpheus will be a masterpiece and have 200 performances. The music is coming on wonderfully, so I won't let you go. But Halévy simply didn't have the time, so Crémieux finished the libretto on his own. Offenbach dedicated the score to Halévy. This is Ernie, who lives with Anya Pustaver, who is singing the role of Minerva. As was normal, many of the roles were written for specific members of the Bouffes-Parisiens company. Let's meet some of them. French soprano Lisa Tatin played Eurydice. She had debuted with the Bouffes-Parisiens the previous year to success. She was 24 when she created Eurydice. Marguerite Massé played Public Opinion. She studied at the Paris Conservatory, joined Offenbach's company at age 19, and had a successful career for decades in both Paris and Brussels. She even ran a musical cafe in Paris for 2 years, and she was 22 when she created Public Opinion. Edward Theodore Nicole, whose stage name was Léonce, played Pluto. He had studied law before becoming a performer. He joined Offenbach in the 1850s and even wrote lyrics for an operetta of his own. He was 35 when he played Pluto. Amable Courtecuisse, whose stage name was Désiré, played Jupiter. The French baritone had become a star in the 1840s. He was hired by Offenbach in 1857 and remained a star of the company until his death. Like Léonce, he was 35 years old. Henri Taillao, whose dates I cannot find, played Orpheus. He was also a violinist and had debuted at the Bouffes-Parisiens in a piece in which he played an amorous veterinary violinist. So yes, the reason Orpheus is a violin player in Offenbach's opera is because of Taillao, who played his own violin during that duet, a feat that subsequent tenors have not repeated. In fact, sidebar, all three of these gentlemen played instruments, and in Offenbach's 1857 piece, The Little Prodigies, Léonce played the cello, Désiré played the bassoon, and Taillao played the violin. The only entirely invented character in the operetta is John Styx, who serves as Pluto's butler of sorts. He was played by a renowned actor from the Comédie Française known as Jacques, and I cannot find his full name. This is the full cast of the premiere, which was conducted by Offenbach. The script and score was full of jokes and puns. In classical plays and operas, there was often a figure called tragedy or music that would give a prologue. Offenbach turned that character into Public Opinion, who plays a similar role. When Jupiter sends the lightning to make Orpheus turn around, Pluto complains that that's not how the myth goes, and Jupiter calmly asks Jupiter for Eurydice's return. He sings lines from Che farò senza Eurydice, the most famous aria in Gluck's Orpheus and Eurydice. When the gods rebel, the Marseillaise is woven into the orchestration. As was normal for Offenbach, the production was lavish, with a set and costumes by Gustave Doré. The show premiered on October 21st, 1858. On opening night, the violin duet and John Styx's couplets were encored. Le Figaro's critic started his verse in rhyme. This is the English translation. Incredible, splendid, astounding, graceful, charming, witty, amusing, successful, perfect, melodious, the opera of Orpheus, it's an opera, will be incontestably, this word will never finish, the most enormous success of the winter. Le Ménestral's critic said the cast did full justice to all the charming jokes, all the delicious originalities, all the farcical oddities thrown in profusion into Offenbach's music. Another critic said, if despite all that you are not entranced by Orpheus, you have only yourself to blame and only your own taste to take it out on. The piece did reasonably well at the box office, but was not the tremendous success Offenbach had hoped for, but then he got lucky. Critic Jules Janin, who had praised earlier Offenbach productions, wrote a furious pan of what he called a profanation of holy and glorious antiquity. Hector Crémieux responded that one of the silliest passages in the opera was a direct quotation from one of Janin's own columns. The resulting public spat brought people to the box office. Offenbach wrote a letter in Le Figaro giving effusive praise and thanks to Janin. After all, a normal Bouffes-Parisiens performance brought in 500 francs a night. Orpheus was taking in 1,600 by the end of its first month, and 2,000 the month after that. One ticket buyer bought the same seat 45 performances in a row. The success of Orpheus finally took care of Offenbach's finances. He even bought a villa on the Normandy coast that he called Orpheus. Orphée aux Enfers ultimately ran for 228 performances, at a time when 100 performances was considered a success. A contemporary writer says the piece closed because the actors, who could not tire the public, were themselves exhausted. This is Stella, who lives with Craig Verm, who is singing the role of Jupiter. Inevitably, people have placed different interpretations on this piece. When it premiered, the focus was on the mockery of classical authors and art. In more recent years, academics have stated that Orpheus was a satire of Napoleon III and the politics of his court. But an Offenbach biographer says, Offenbach was no anarchist attacking the rule of Napoleon III. This was a boulevard entertainer skating on thin ice as he was expected to do, a court jester taking people's breath away with his smiling audacity. The last thing Offenbach planned was the destruction of a society which applauded his music and flocked to his theater. Indeed, the emperor enjoyed a command performance in April 1860, which led directly to Offenbach becoming a French citizen. Interestingly, the success of Offenbach's Orpheus did nothing to dim the success of Gluck's more serious Orpheus and Eurydice opera. A year after Offenbach's comedy premiered, a new version of Gluck's opera premiered to great success, starring Pauline Viardot. So the two pieces went head to head in France for decades, as you can see from this cartoon. The first production outside France was in Breslau, Germany, a year after the premiere. Within a year of that, there were premieres across Europe, then into South America, the US, and even Australia. It premiered in New York in 1861 in German. A prominent lawyer called it a funny extravaganza that has had a great run in Paris. Music by the celebrated Offenbach, whoever he is. That first New York production ran for almost a year. After that, New York saw a new production every few years, some in German, some in French, some in English. It opened in London in 1865 in English with the title Orpheus in the Haymarket. It was massively rewritten, with Orpheus now a composer for music halls, and John Styx reimagined as Pluto's three-headed dog. More London productions followed over the decades, some in French, some in English. Meanwhile, back in Paris, after the initial run, the Bouffes-Parisiens toured Orpheus to the French provinces, where it was a big hit. The company then revived the show every few years, in 1860, 1862, and 1867. Understand that Offenbach was writing new works. Orpheus was just the standard hit he kept bringing back when he needed a boost at the box office, as you can see from this cartoon. Offenbach was not above stunt casting. The 1867 production featured celebrated courtesan Cora Pearl as Cupid, a fairly small role at the time. One historian writes, "That evening, the Jockey Club in its entirety graced the theater. All the names of French nobility were there. It was a success of a kind." And then, as I mentioned, the Franco-Prussian War broke out in 1870, and Offenbach fled France. His works were vilified in France as superficial, although he remained successful elsewhere. He returned to Paris in late 1871, and in 1873 took on management of a new theater, the Théâtre de la Gaîté. He needed a hit for this new venue, so he substantially expanded Orpheus in the Underworld. He doubled the length of the score and turned it into a 4-act spectacular with substantial ballet sequences. Cupid and Mercury were given songs, and Eurydice was given a new one. The size of the cast grew, with 9 additional principal roles, not to mention a much bigger chorus. The orchestra grew too. It now had 60 players instead of 30, plus a military band of another 40 players for the procession of the gods from Mount Olympus to Hades. The new version premiered in February 1874. One review said, "Orphée aux Enfers is above all a good show. Offenbach's music has retained its youth and spirit. The amusing operetta of yore has become a splendid extravaganza." The revised Orpheus broke box office records, just as the original had done. During its run, Offenbach expanded it even further, adding a ballet set in Neptune's kingdom, complete with dancing shellfish, and bringing the total number of scenes to 22. The piece was revived every few years over the next decade. Still, criticism never died down. In the 1881 Dictionary of Opera, the authors called Orpheus a coarse and grotesque parody full of vulgar and indecent scenes that give off an unhealthy smell. As the 19th century turned into the 20th, revivals continued around the world. They now had multiple sets of music to choose from, the original 1858 production and the very elaborate 1874 version. To say there is no definitive Orpheus in the Underworld is an understatement. And of course, by far the most famous part of the piece is the infernal gallop, which the gods sing and dance in Hades. The irony is that it was not the most famous part of the show when the show premiered. The hymn to Bacchus was the major success, often encored 3 times at each performance. And although we all call it a can-can, it's not a can-can. It didn't become identified as that until the Moulin Rouge opened and adopted it in the 1890s. After everything I've said, you may wonder why you haven't really heard of this piece if it was so famous for so long. I think the answer lies in the way we tend to pit serious art against popular art. Offenbach wrote popular art, funny shows, music that could be hummed, and productions that had glitz and glamour. So when he died, more serious composers and critics dismissed his work as frivolous. And maybe it is, in the sense that the sole purpose of Orpheus in the Underworld is to entertain. But I think that can be a good quality. At a time when the world's challenges grow greater every day, it can be nice to escape into a world that takes nothing seriously other than the need to have fun. This is Rupert, who lives with Emily Glick, who is singing the role of Juno. This will be Madison Opera's first production of this piece, and this is our cast. On Earth, we have Jasmine Habersham as Eurydice. She sang at Digital Opera in the Park 2020, and this will be her in-person debut with us. Christian Sanders sings Orpheus in his debut, and Laurel Submergent debuts as Public Opinion. Down in Hades, Brian Vu sings Pluto in his debut. Robert Godrich, who has sung with us often, sings John Styx. On Mount Olympus, we have a whole host of people. Craig Verm sings Jupiter. He sang Friedrich Bear in Little Women here in 2015. Emily Glick sings Juno. She was just in She Loves Me with us. We have 3 former studio artists returning: Gillian Hollis as Cupid, Emily Secor as Diana, and Kirsten Lippert as Venus. And we have 3 current studio artists: Tyrese Bird as Mercury, Anya Plastaver as Minerva, and Jake Surzan as Mars. Our production is directed by Stephanie Havey in her debut, with scenery from New Orleans Opera. It's set in the early 1960s, which means some really awesome evening gowns, all designed by Madison's own Karen Brown Larimore. And we are doing the original 1858 version, i.e. the short one. But like so many productions, we have added a couple numbers from the 1874 version. We are also performing this show in English. I think it's one that works best if you can understand all of the double entendres, and there are a lot of them. So now let's go to questions. If you're watching this on April 8th, please type your questions into the YouTube conversation box so I can see them. And if you're watching this afterwards, feel free to email me at info@madisonopera.org. But while you're thinking of some questions, let's go back to Hades for the end of the opera as Eurydice dedicates herself to Bacchus. I will say that I always think of that end of that show as basically Offenbach looked at his watch and said, let's just wrap this up and do a final number. Okay, 2 questions. Hi, Harry. I wonder if we might be able to come up with a new 2 short opera program like Cav Pag with one of Offenbach's shorter pieces. You'd actually probably want to do 4 of them. I've done a couple of them. I did one called The Cat Who Turned Into a Woman. I've listened to some of the others, and they are largely delightful. To be honest, it's the sort of thing that if we had, say, the Playhouse, we could do like 4 pieces in a night, and it would be less than 2 hours. They're really charming. There's a recording I have with a lot of obscure Offenbach, and it's just also fun. Is Offenbach singular, or is there something particularly French or Second Empire about his idiom and sensibility? I don't know if it's Second Empire per se. He was definitely singular. I mean, he invented this form pretty much and took it far out. His heirs, if you think that you don't really know Offenbach, Gilbert and Sullivan basically were mimicking Offenbach. They come about 20 years later, and in fact, their first piece, or one of their first pieces, Trial by Jury, was written as like a curtain raiser on a production of an Offenbach operetta. And it's not even talking about Tales of Hoffmann, which is an extraordinary work that is almost very different. So yeah, Offenbach is singular, that many tunes. Was Offenbach always consistently popular after his death, or was there a revival at some point? I think there was a revival, because one of the things that happened, besides everyone thinking that if music is fun, it can't be serious. Remember I said Offenbach was Jewish. So that means that during the 30s and 40s, all of his works were banned in Germany and Austria and all of that. So you see productions into the early 20th century, even in Berlin in the 1920s. And then basically they start to come back in the 60s and 70s. Have singers who sing in Orpheus in the Underworld also performed dramatic or canonical operatic roles, or was this historically more like musical theater? When the piece was new, they were sort of their own company of musical theater type performers. They performed in other composers' operettas, but I don't really know of any Offenbach, Bouffes-Parisiens performers who also sang at like the Paris Opera in the big Verdi operas. Nowadays, of course, we expect singers to be able to do everything, whether it's Offenbach or Mozart or Verdi or She Loves Me. Hey, Jill. Are the singers dancing in this production? Yes, they are. We start rehearsal tomorrow, a music rehearsal, and one of the first rehearsals on Sunday staging is basically a 1-hour dance class. And yeah, we will see who's really good. We'll see who wants to kick their legs up. But as you saw in what I showed you, the singers sing the can-can and they dance the can-can. Okay, I am going to draw this preview to a close if there are no more questions. Thank you for joining me. I hope this made you smile a little bit. I hope we will see you at Orpheus in the Underworld later this month. Have a good night.